Welcome back from the break, everybody. We're in the home stretch now. I want to encourage you, if you haven't had a chance to go and visit the networking lounges, there's video networking in there. There's chairs open and available. So in between sessions, feel free to pop in there and interact with your favorite people in the Magento community. Speaking of favorite people, I've got a former colleague of mine at Creativity that I get to announce now. That's not surreal at all. Wesley Guthrie is the Director of Managed Services over there at Creativity. He's been working on Magento sites for almost 7 years, doing everything from development to technical lead to business analysis, and now running a department that does all of these things. He's been around the block when it comes to Magento. He's been speaking at tech conferences on and off for 3 years as well. Other things on his list of achievement are core contributions to Magento, participating in many hackathons over the years, and even buying a Magento colored car. I want a picture. You'll have to send that to me. It is my pleasure and privilege to introduce Wesley Guthrie. Wesley, take it away.
All right, thanks, Shannon. So today, going to be presenting how not to lose sleep over your page speed scores. Basically, a deep dive into page scoring. So a little bit about me, like Shannon said, I'm the Director of Managed Services for Creativity. Contact information on the screen, basically in charge of all of our live services. So everybody, I think, already has seen at one time or another in their life PageSpeed Insights. We're all familiar with what this page looks like, but I think most of us are at a point where that score at the top of the page tends to be a mythical unicorn of sorts, where we almost know what that is representing and how it's calculated, and hope that Google doesn't just magically calculate a number and throw it at us and think it means something. So what is PageSpeed Insights? It's a tool to measure your page speed. So it's a little bit different than site speed. Site speed is an average of a sampling of pages across the site, where page speed is just that single page. So PageSpeed Insight is published by Google live online, where you can use a tool called Lighthouse, which is what runs behind the scenes, and that can be ran from Chrome. So by Google's definition, Lighthouse is an open source automated tool for improving the quality of web pages. You can run it against any web page, public or requiring authentication. It has audits for performance, accessibility, and progressive web apps, SEO, and more. So a little bit about Lighthouse. So like I said, it's found in Google Chrome. You can right-click, go to the inspect menus, and it's the last tab all the way to the right next to security. So you'll go there, you run the audit after you select some of your options, and you can run an audit on any page that is live on the internet. So what you end up getting from that is similar results than PageSpeed. PageSpeed gives you one big number that ranks the whole page. Lighthouse is going to give you 4 numbers. Depending on how you run it, you can get 5 numbers. I'm not going to cover the progressive web app number. I'll be covering the other 4. Major difference between those two, like I said, Lighthouse gives you the separate scores and separate granularity of each of those points against each number, or each score, instead of PageSpeed, which puts it all in one big report against one big number. Kind of makes it a little bit foggy as to how it's impacting everything. So this is what you end up getting from Lighthouse. You get 4 scores, unlike you do on PageSpeed. Those 4 are performance, accessibility, best practices, and SEO. So performance, kind of mostly your developer tools. This is going to be PageSpeed performance, different increments of speed in different pieces of the site of how it's rendering the site. Accessibility is around ADA compliance, screen readers, ease of view. It's not 100% ADA compliance. It's a good start and good first step to it. It's not a full, complete ADA scan of the site, though. Best practices, it's basically following whether you are constructing your pages correctly, following web best practices, whether you have SSL certificates, things like that. And SEO is checking how optimized your site is for search engines like Google and Bing. So let's work through each of those individually. So performance gives you 3 main sections. First one is metrics. You see this section on your page speed scores as well. So these 6 numbers are what break down and actually create the score. So first, contentful paint. First time you see something on the screen, whether it's text, images, any other content, it's the first time something shows up on that screen. Speed index is how long it takes for the majority of your content to become visible and populated. Largest contentful paint is Lighthouse determines what on the page is the largest important piece of that site and how that is, or when that is going to be loaded. So that's the measurement from the time it starts to the time you see the first major piece of content. Time to interactive is once all of your interactive pieces of your site are loaded completely. So whether that's JavaScript for drop-down menus to sliders to different videos, other things can be interactive on the site. Whatever it takes to load all of that completely is what that score ends up being. Total blocking time. So this calculates only things that are render blocking for an extensive period of time. So anything over 50 milliseconds. Doesn't calculate anything lower than that, but your render blocking assets can be things like JavaScript, CSS, images, other assets that have to be loaded on the page that could be blocking other assets from loading. And your cumulative layout shift. So this is the amount of time that you spend shifting the layout based on what's loading on the site and the different pieces of content and the time it takes for each of those to load. So what Lighthouse does is take those values based on weighted scores for each and shows you how to break down that score that it gave you for performance from these 6 numbers. To get to this calculator, so I put in the screenshot of what metrics look like. There's the link at the bottom that says See Calculator. That'll open what you see on the right hand of your screen there, where it breaks down each score. You have sliders for each, so you can slide those around to see if I say remove 10 seconds from time to interactive, what's that going to do to my performance score and how does that affect it? So you're able to see what that looks like, where's the best impact to your site, and which pieces of that score are going to impact your overall score the most. Moving on to opportunities, which is the next section under performance. So these are going to be, these don't affect your performance score directly, but these are going to be the suggestions that Lighthouse gives you based on estimated savings. So what it sees is saving time in your load. The best way to work through this list is top down. It's going to order it based on your savings, and the bars next to it are going to give you kind of an idea of the impact of this. So more common things that you see here: deferring your off-screen images, removing unused JavaScript and CSS, render blocking assets, time to load JavaScript libraries and things like that. Moving on to third excuse me, third section is diagnostics. So unlike the last section was based on just time, this is other information that it is finding about the site that it sees as standing out to your performance. So things like excessive DOM size, the number of HTML elements that you're loading within that HTML document, the size of the network load, so how much the page weighs, basically, with all the images, everything included in that, and the file size of that when you're downloading all of those. So different aspects here. Again, this is working this top down through this list can affect your score. It doesn't do it directly, but these are good ways to improve your page speed score based on what it's seeing in the times to load to create the score for this. Moving on to accessibility. So these are opportunities around how to use the site, the ease of the site, color contrast between elements, the size of tab elements, the spacing between those tab elements, more around the usage of screen readers as well. So making sure you have alt texts on images, alt texts on links, things to that degree to help with the accessibility and the ability to use the site in a friendly kind of way. Best practices covers areas like checking whether you have an SSL cert, so whether you're under HTTPS and not just HTTP for the page that you're scoring for, different vulnerabilities within third-party JavaScript libraries, sizing and aspect ratio of images. So if you're downloading images and say they're 2000 pixels by 2000 pixels, but you're only rendering it on the screen at 100 pixels by 100 pixels, that's not really the best practice. You'd end up downloading that huge image and just scaling it down at the time of load instead of loading it and downloading it the size that you're actually rendering it at. Also, we'll check aspect ratio, whether you've distorted the image or not. It's going to check for validity of cross-origin links. So if you have links on your site that go out to other domains, you should be using no refer or no opener tags on those so that you're not causing those to be attached to your site in ways that aren't according to best practices. as well as other details of how the page is built and whether there's certain tags in a certain place, certain attributes that may be missing from certain HTML tags and things like that. And then the last section is SEO. So this is to optimize the page for search engine ranking. There's no real silver bullet to this. So if you have a score of 98, 100, doesn't mean you're going to rank high in Google or in Bing. But the other end of this is true, where if you do have a low score to SEO, it does hurt your chances of ranking higher. These are things like making sure you have proper title and meta information on your pages, that the site is actually able to be indexed. You have nothing blocking that indexing. You have a proper robots.txt file and the file is accessible. Making sure your fonts are proper size, legible, making sure that the characters are spaced enough to that, different things to that degree. For mobile, making sure your tap areas are properly sized. So proper sizing is minimum of 48 by 48 pixels. Anything smaller height or width of that is considered to be too small for a mobile tap area. So when you're working on a phone or things like that, end up on some of those sites where the links are just so small they're really hard to click on. That's to help make sure that your tap elements are able to be used easier. And again, this will also help check for image links and making sure that they have descriptive text elements. So both the alt texts, as well as making sure there's some kind of description or other things around that on the page to make it meaningful, and it's not just a link farm or a collage of images that don't really have much context to each other. So, let's move on to different things that we see with these and common issues within Magento 2 that end up showing up more commonly within PageSpeed. So one of the most common things that I've seen show up in PageSpeed scores and Lighthouse scores for Magento is images. So whether it's loading them in proper web formats using WebP or different approved JPEG formats, making sure that they're served the proper sizes, that you're not downloading larger images than you need to, and that images below the fold get lazy loaded. What that means is instead of loading it at the time of load, you load it, if you've ever been on one of those pages, that as you scroll, the images start to pop up after while you're scrolling down. That's lazy loading. That way you don't have to load every image on the page. You only load what you can see when you load the page directly. Next common thing that I end up seeing is unused JavaScript and unused CSS. This ends up becoming a wormhole of sorts where you end up spending a lot more time trying to fix these two things in Magento than is going to be beneficial to the actual score and improving the score. Most of that is due to how Magento is building the front-end assets, building the JavaScript, building the CSS. So it builds those as one file, sometimes multiple files, depending on how you have bundling set up, but it's built as a total site set of libraries, I'll call it. So you end up with all the styles that you need. So you may be on the home page, but you're still going to load the styles that you may need on checkout and vice versa. Still going to see those as unused because it's not used on that page, but Magento may still need them on another page. So it may seem like it's unused here, but because Magento is loading everything into one big file, you're seeing it as a unused JavaScript and unused CSS as part of these reports. Next thing is we see is avoiding too many third-party JavaScript libraries. So things like user tracking software. An example of it is something like Hotjar. Now, I'm not saying the user tracking software is bad for the site. It is taking time to load it as JavaScript. If it's a tool that you're using and you have a marketing team or an SEO team that uses the information that comes from that on a daily or weekly basis, then it's useful and you should keep it. If it's something that you're accruing data from, but nobody ever signs into it, nobody looks at it, there's no real reason to incur that impact on your scores and on your load times if you just have libraries that are just loaded and almost becoming a collection of what we have built into a site. Next thing that I end up seeing is DOM size tends to start to become excessive. So a lot more HTML than is actually needed to load the site. That comes from Magento being a modular system. If you have a lot of modules that have visual elements that load on the page, each individual element may be optimized by themselves, but due to the amount of elements that are there, you may end up with a lot more HTML tags than is perceived. And same with CMS content. One of the things I end up seeing is people would copy their content from another editing tool, whether it's Microsoft Office or other editing tools that add markup to that text before you copy it in, and that marked up text has extra HTML in it. It's not really necessary for what you're building. WYSIWYG editors can also end up doing the same, where it adds extra DOM elements that may not be needed and end up bloating the DOM size as an overall document. Another big culprit to DOM size is your mega menus. So end up seeing 2/3 of the page being just loading a menu and all of the different content that goes into it, subcategories and subcategories of those subcategories. All those dropdowns end up being their own sets of HTML tags. And one way to move away from that is having mega menus that load those via AJAX instead of trying to load the whole menu in and then using JavaScript to make the different pieces disappear. Instead, when you hover over, they load them in individually based on what you're trying to find. Next big thing that helps with your page speed scores is deferring JavaScript and CSS. So one thing that happens, it becomes render blocking, where you end up downloading each JavaScript library and each CSS file individually. One blocks the next one in line, and that one blocks the next one in line, and they end up blocking each other, causing your time to load a lot quicker. The process of deferring that takes it out of the head of the document, out of the tag called head, moves it down into the body, and allows it to load after the page itself starts loading, instead of saying that it has to be loaded before you can start doing anything with the page. Also helps with loading them asynchronously, so that they can download and start to be processed by the browser at the same time, instead of waiting for the next one in line and the one before it to finish. Improving cache policies is another one that helps with page speed scores. When cache policies on certain assets start to take a long time to refresh on the far side, or don't take any time at all, and you're always downloading new ones, it tends to impact your page speed score, because it's whether the content is relevant. If it's been there too long, it starts to be seen as not relevant when you have a cache policy that's, don't change forever or don't change for 3 years. When cache policies become too small and it's change it every day, or change it when it's counted in hours, and we're talking about every 6 hours, you have to get a new one for cache policy. Now, again, it's a recommendation if there's a use case and a need for the cache policy to be set at what it's set at based on what the JavaScript library is or how often the image may change. There's suggestions to improve the score. It doesn't mean that you have to do it. Avoiding excessive redirects. So two of the most common redirects that you end up seeing is redirecting from HTTP to HTTPS, as well as redirecting from www. to one that doesn't have a CNAME in front of it, or vice versa, where you go from no CNAME to www. Both of those are individual redirects, so that adds 2 right there, plus any other 301 redirect you may have had on that page. Each of those adds to the amount of time it takes to get to the page loading, and the longer chain you have of those excessive redirects, the longer it takes for everything to load. The last one is enabling gzip compression. It's probably about the easiest one out of this whole list. It's usually a server configuration, and just turning it on, it allows the page itself and the DOM itself to be loaded in a smaller format. And then when it's served to the browser then unzips it, kind of like zip files work. So that allows the site to download quicker, download the assets quicker, allows it to then load the site quicker. So in conclusion here, PageSpeed score kind of is a 30,000 foot view score. Gives you the high level score of everything that's going on. Using Lighthouse gives you those granular scores into each section to understand exactly what you're looking at, what you're trying to fix, and which score is the most impactful to what you're trying to achieve, instead of just chasing one big number. Lighthouse, like I said, also it organizes everything in a priority order. So through any of those lists that show up, work them top down. The one at the top of the list is the one that's impacting your site the most. Knocking those ones out are going to help you the most. Also, they're color coded. Anything red impacts a lot. Starting into the oranges and the yellows, those impact less. So working your way top down gives you a priority order of what is the next thing to be trying to fix on the site. Like I said, remember, not everything here is mandatory. They're recommendations. You don't have to follow it. Weigh your costs to your benefits. If the amount of development work that's going to take here to fix one of these, like unused JavaScript or unused CSS, is hundreds of hours of work, and you increase your score by 2, really not worth it. But something that's going to take 20 minutes to fix, like the GSIP compression, where it's literally 5-minute fix, and you can increase your page speed score by 5 to 10 points, makes it worthwhile doing. The score itself is not everything. So if we look at Amazon.com during its peak hours, which is most hours of the day, their score is below 50 most of the time, usually sits in the high 40s. Doesn't mean that the page itself is necessarily a bad page. They just have a lot going on their page. They serve a lot of information, and it's not a priority to them to be following everything that Lighthouse is saying to do. Like I said, they're recommendations of what's the best way to serve your site. Last thing I want to say here is don't think that you have to get a score of 100. Score of 100 means you are in the top 99 percentile of the internet. You are one of the fastest sites working on the internet. Be nice to have all those scores at 100. Aiming for getting your scores into the green, which is anything above 90, is a good goal to have, but again, not a necessity to make sure you worry about every score and every recommendation. You end up spending the same amount of work to go from 99 to 100 as you do to go from 90 to 95, as you do to go from 65 to 80. So the lower your score, the easier it is to start moving up, but the closer you get to perfect, the harder it is to get that needle to move. So at the end of the day, scores of 100 are not a 100% necessity. So that's all I have to explain here with page speed scores. There was a little bit more of doing this where it was going to be a case study, and I don't have the permission to do that necessarily as a case study, so I'm not able to share all of that information as I was planning to. So Janet, at this time I'll open it up to any questions.
Fantastic. And nice teaser about the case study. I'm definitely going to be back in touch with you to try to get a hold of that. And I think a lot of our viewers will as well.
Well, yeah, once I have that permission, I will end up posting that online, most likely through my Twitter. So when I do have that information, it will be posted. But right now I don't. So.
No worries. Well, you did a fantastic job on the presentation. Very grateful for that. I think you probably did too good of a job. We've got a couple of questions here, and I'm going to get right to them. So Brian asks, for images in WebP or approved JPEG, do you have a recommended module or approach for this?
I'm sorry, you cut out a little bit there, Shannon. Can you repeat that, at least the second half of that?
Yes. So for images in WebP or approved JPEG, do you have a recommended module or approach for this?
Yes, actually, my recommended approach would be using something from a CDN. So Cloudflare has abilities to convert images to WebP directly through their serving of CDN files. So does Fastly. Those are the two I know. Knowing that those are pretty large market share of CDNs, I'm assuming other CDNs as well also have that ability. There are some modules, I think there's one or two on Magento Marketplace, as well as other Magento modules that do it without going through a CDN, but you also get the benefit of being on a CDN as well and serving those from outside your site. So you kind of kill two birds with one stone with doing that.
Fantastic. And we've got a question from David. He says, are there obvious page speed recommendations that aren't actually valid for typical Magento sites and that should be ignored or reviewed more carefully?
I think the one that stands out the most, like I said, is the unused JavaScript and unused CSS, where it calls it out as unused, where it's not actually unused. It's just used on a different page. I think that's probably about the most invalid ones. It comes down to more of weighing your cost to benefits and weighing the importance of what's being called out in those reports versus just doing it because it's in the report and it's red, so I have to fix it. Weigh what it actually is and what it's asking you to fix, and if it's something you actually business need of fixing.
And the last question today, in your experience, does critical CSS implementation increase the score?
By itself, as a practice, not necessarily. It can if it's done correctly, because you're going to be fixing how your first content pane Yeah, first content paint, FCP, which is part of that performance score. So you can improve your performance score by doing that. But like I said, it's based on how you implement it and what you're actually painting with part of your critical CSS. So if you're actually putting something contentful within that critical, then yes, you can improve the scores. But just by saying I'm going to do critical CSS, it's a specific way of doing it, but still a very broad way of saying I'm going to implement something. Doesn't necessarily mean it's going to just silver bullet fix it.
Got it. Wesley, I can't thank you enough. It was great running into you, even if it was virtual. Hopefully we'll be doing this again in New York, and I look forward to seeing you there next year. For everyone else going on to the next session, be sure to refresh your browser so that the presentation you see actually matches the name of our presenter, and we will see you at the next one, and have a great afternoon.
All right, thanks, Shannon.